Welcome or welcome back to the Invisible Lives Silent Voices seminar for our 5th session this year, which will revolve around postcolonial studies. It's truly an honor for us to have the opportunity to listen to Dr. Corinna Stan from Duke University and to Dr. Judith Misrai-Barak from the Université Paul Valéry Montpellier 3 today. And we wanted to warmly thank you and them both for accepting our invitation. Now, we're also always extremely grateful to the specialists who agree to chair our seminar sessions, but I think tonight we'll owe a special debt of gratitude to Professor Vanessa Guignery from the École Normale Supérieure de Lyon, who is joining us from India today during the very last few hours of her research trip. So on behalf of the organizing team, I would like to thank her once again and our guest speakers again. So I guess now, having spoken long enough, I get to gladly make myself invisible and silent again and leave the floor to Vanessa for the introduction of this session.
Thank you very much, Eloise, and hello everyone. I would first like to thank Eloise and Alice for organizing this very stimulating seminar, and also for inviting me to chair today's session on postcolonial studies, which promises to be very enriching. So we'll hear the two presentations by Dr. Corinna Stan and Dr. Judith Misrai-Barak, and then we'll have time for discussion and questions. And you'll be able to ask your questions directly by unmuting yourselves, or you may write them down in the chat. So I'm delighted to present our first speaker, Dr. Corinna Stan, who is an Associate Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Duke University, where she received her PhD after a DEA or MPhil at Paris 7 and a Maîtrise or Master's degree at Paris 4. She's the author of The Art of Distances, Ethical Thinking in 20th Century Literature, published with Northwestern University Press in 2018, and of articles published in New German Critique, Comparative Literature Studies, Modern Language Notes, Philosophy and Literature, Novel, Journal of Postcolonial Writing, Études Britanniques Contemporaines, Critical Inquiry, and other journals. In recent years, she has developed a portfolio of public-oriented essays and conversations that have appeared in The Point, Ian, Esprit, the LA Times, the Novel Podcast, among others. She's currently co-editing the Palgrave Handbook on Migration in European Literature and Culture, and she's at work on a book entitled After the West. And the title of her talk today is After the West, Europe and its Integrated Rejects. So Corinna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I also want to thank Alice Borrego, Eloise Leconte, and Guillaume Leblanc for organizing this wonderful series of talks, and also Vanessa Guignery for accepting to chair the panel, especially from India. that shows a lot of dedication. I also want to thank you all for being here at this late stage in the academic year, when I have no doubt you have so much to do. So the talk is indeed part of a book that I am writing. I'm sort of halfway or beyond the half point with it. So part of it is excerpts from the book and part of it is summary. Could you please, Alice or Eloise, I don't know who of you will play the clip from Federico Fellini's Satyricon.
Sono un poeta. Tu dirai, ma com'è che sei vestito così malamente? Proprio per questo. La passione per l'arte non ha mai arricchito nessuno. Non so perché, ma la povertà è sempre sorella del genio. Mi chiamo Eumolpo. I capolavori che vedi in questa pinacoteca denunciano il letargo attuale. Una pittura così oggi non la sa fare nessuno. E da che cosa è stata provocata questa rivoluzione? Dalla brama del denaro. Nei tempi andati l'ideale degli uomini era la virtù pura e semplice. E per questo fiorivano le arti liberali. Eudoso invecchiò sopra una montagna per cogliere il moto degli astri. Lisippo disegnò tutta la vita un unico modello e morì di fame. E invece noi, tra vino e baldracche, neppure i capolavori che ci sono conosciamo più. Ma dove sta la dialettica? Dove è andata l'astronomia? Dov'è la filosofia che una volta era la strada maestra? Non ti meravigliare, mio giovane amico, che la pittura è finita, quando ormai per tutti noi c'è più bellezza in un mucchio d'oro che nelle opere di Apelle o di Fidia. Quei greculi, teste matte.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this short excerpt. So in Federico Fellini's Satyricon, an impoverished poet, Eumolpus, deplores the general depravity at Nero's court. Greedy and promiscuous, ignorant of the past, logic and astronomy, his contemporaries, he says, have strayed from the exquisite road to wisdom. Eumolpus's lament resonates well beyond Petronius's first-century Rome or Fellini's 1960s Italy. Teleported into the world of Michel Houellebecq's Submission, he would probably gasp to see civilization sunk further into decadence. Willfully ignorant of the past, the West, according to Houellebecq, has replaced the exercise of logic with collective stupor, interest in astronomy with petty individualism, even the enjoyment of opulent feasts and copulation with the pathetic solitude of microwave meals and online pornography. The resonance between Petronius's satire and Houellebecq's uncompromising diagnosis is not fortuitous. The anxiety of decline has traversed the history of the West since the collapse of the Roman Empire, which for historians like Montesquieu and Gibbons served as a cautionary tale. When Oswald Spengler published The Decline of the West in 1919, his title captured for many the enduring apprehension of an imminent fall of Western civilization and anticipated the end of an era of world domination by European imperial powers. The popularity of Goncourt laureate Houellebecq is similarly symptomatic of Occidental malaise. The publication of Submission on the day of the Charlie Hebdo attacks seemed nothing short of prophetic, a novel about the exhaustion of Western civilization and its incorporation into Arabia by a Muslim president, read like a fitting prelude to the Greek crisis, the refugee crisis, the rise of the European far right, and Brexit, all episodes in the drama of a protracted European identity crisis. The mode of lament is one extreme of the discourse of the end of the West. The nostalgia for the days of imperial glory permeating books like Walter Laqueur's Last Days of Europe, Alexandra Lavastine's The Suicidal Tendencies of Europe, or Niall Ferguson's Civilizations, the West and the Rest, suggests that many Europeans and Europhiles remain apologists of European superiority even after Europe relinquished its status as the West to the United States following the losses of 2 world wars. Such positions are impervious to the vigorous post-colonial critique of the past decades, echoing Aimé Césaire's indictment of Europe as indefensible in discourse on colonialism. They are also impervious to Hannah Arendt's warning in Origins of Totalitarianism that, I quote, "The racism of imperialism and National Socialism may carry out the doom of the Western world and the end of Western man," unquote. Building on the well-established post-colonial critique of Eurocentrism from Samir Amin to Stuart Hall, Edward Said, Dipesh Chakrabarti, and others, Silvia Federici has denounced the very notion of the West as a mystifying fiction without a coherent or stable referent, and the Western civilization framework as a construct violating the very principles of truthfulness and rationality it claims to promote. So between these 2 extremes, nostalgic lament on one hand and indictment on the other, warning on one hand and critical denunciation, a recent book, Europe, A Philosophical History, published in 2021, so just last year. So this book establishes Simon Glendinning as the contemporary philosopher most committed to a sort of middle-of-the-road view. He does not defend the Eurocentric conception, nor does he provide a critique of it from an anti-Eurocentric point of view. Instead, his argument is that we, the Europeans, and these are his words, cannot not inherit the Western philosophical tradition. So he reconstructs it from the inside and orients it towards the future. So a very promising project. Glandining's own diagnosis of the times still resonates with Welbeck's. He's concerned, for example, that we do not share a sense of the significance of human life on Earth. I quote, "We are, it seems, becoming mere occupants of a sometimes barely sustainable and certainly increasingly fragile life support system, with no higher heading than continued functioning, or rather, no higher heading than the optimizing of its performative functioning, as if our heading today was simply to transform the world into a 24/7 convenience store and petrol station, and the world's ancient and holy places made into heritage sites and visitor attractions." And yet, Glandining inherits from Derrida the vision of a democracy to come. His book often reads like a tribute to his French predecessor, whose readings of Kant, UNESCO lectures, known as The Other Heading, and Spectres of Marx, provide the scaffolding and some of the leitmotifs woven through these volumes. Heading, for example, what does it mean? Well, Derrida takes the geography of Europe, a westward promontory on the continent of Asia, and overlays it with the teleology of philosophical history, a discourse inherited from Kant by Hegel, Marx, and other European philosophers all the way to Fukuyama, who understood universal history as headed westward, with Europe as the avant-garde of humanity. Now, I should note that this westward heading refers to a time when the term the West, or l'Occident, coincided roughly with Europe, and it was the secular substitute for an older term, Christendom, at the time embattled with Islam. For centuries, the West referred to Europe and its peoples and was used in the context of European colonialism. It only came to include the United States in the 20th century. In 1919, Paul Valéry wondered whether Europe would be what it was, in reality, a small promontory on the continent of Asia, or what it seemed, the elect portion of the terrestrial globe, the pearl of the sphere, the brain of a vast body. After World War I, the mantle of the West was in fact taken over by the US, a shift that solidified with the Marshall Plan after World War II. The imaginary of Europe has remained, however, intimately connected with the idea of Western teleology and the glorious story of European man, that is, the story of European humanism, as Jacques Derrida mused in The Other Heading. Bearing his playful signature, the text intimates other possibilities for the future of a Europe after the West, such as the heading of the other heading, and the other of the heading. This is all typical Derrida. Much hinges in this argument on the undefined use of others, or the other, as the index of a cosmopolitan ethos of openness to anyone and to the future of a democracy to come. The question is, what is Europe once it has given up the misguided teleology of its westward heading? It is precisely this question that preoccupies Simon Glandining, whose project is to reconstruct the European self-understanding, and its patron saint is none other than Jacques Derrida. After the West captures the philosopher's aspiration, and probably our own, on behalf of Europe to be a fairer place for everyone who considers themselves European today. Now, the problem is that to aspire is one thing, and how to get to that vision another. I am in full agreement with Glandining that we cannot not inherit our inheritance. As I read his account, however, I am floored by the weight of the philosophical discourse he reconstructs. It's the account of history producing ideas that have shaped the European self-understanding, and many people, it's clear, still believe them today. What's striking is that the account offered by Glandining, a philosopher with liberal values, is ultimately involute. It makes me wonder whether it points to the limits of philosophy. In what follows, I will offer a brief critical reading of his book. A full review is forthcoming in The Point, and will argue that philosophy needs to acknowledge its others, history and literature. They show that Europe's others have been indispensable to the development of the West, but disposable as individuals with singular lives. In other words, they are integrated rejects. And I will illustrate that offering a brief reading of one of Abbas Kidar's books. All right, so here is a brief summary of Glendinning's book. Glendinning writes self-consciously not as a historian, illuminating the fate of peoples and fatherlands, but as a philosopher, mapping the European self-understanding in the epic narratives of man and his history. This difference is thematized as a problem throughout the two volumes, as a tension between, on one hand, empirical history, which is events that shape the world, such as wars, economic crisis, colonialism, and so on, often narrated following the European historian's golden thread that runs from Greece and Rome through Christianity to the modern age. And on the other hand, philosophical history, that is, how thinkers from Immanuel Kant to Francis Fukuyama have thought about the meaning and sense of world history. Europe, Glendinning argues, is tied up with the very idea of philosophy. That's because Europe is the heir of ancient Greek culture, the birthplace of theoria, a discipline that is universal because no pre-given opinion is accepted uncritically. Therefore, none of its ideas are bound to local custom or any form of local humanness. Glendinning sees philosophy as inseparable from its mission to contribute to the universal community, and Europe's geopolitical significance and identity is, he says, irreducibly caught up with the geophilosophical, cosmopolitan, and universal trajectory. So Europe equals philosophy. But then what is philosophy? Well, philosophical activity is premised on the anthropological notion of man as a thinking animal endowed with reason and capable of speech. This distinctive anthropology, later drawn into the theology of Christian creationism, ens creatum, man made in the image of God, is at the heart of the European understanding of the history of man as progression from a primitive state to a maximally rational life for all humanity. That is, from barbarism to civilization, from potentiality to the full realization of one's rational capacities. Kant, Hegel, and Marx all framed empirical history as a process of the self-realization of man as man. For them, everything that happened in the world, including crisis, destruction, and war, was part of a future-oriented history heading towards, I quote, a state of peace, freedom, and well-being for all humanity. Europe, Glendinning shows, was for these philosophers the universal and cosmopolitan horizon, the very promise of modernity captured by the first volume's title. Now, the unraveling of this promise is the initial subject of Volume 2, Beyond Modernity. And yet, instead of unraveling it, Glendinning declares the discourse exhausted and writes, "We today are the inheritors of the modern European understanding of the world and the significance of our lives. That belongs to this epoch of archaeoteleological reason and its inseparable anthropocentrism, androcentrism, ethnocentrism, and Eurocentrism." So this is a quote from page 159 from Volume 2. It's the first time that Glendinning, or one of the first times that Glendinning finally says something negative about this whole discourse. And he turns back to the dead white European male philosophers, these are his words, whose texts, although history-producing and thus complicit with the worst, again, these are his words, also promise a future that is not white through and through, not European through and through, and not male through and through. Glendinning is confident in the promise of a new conception of man and history, a new conception of being human that he sees coalescing in European thought. So what does that conception look like? Glendinning formulates it drawing on Isaiah Berlin, Jacques Derrida, and Stanley Cavell. Whereas Kant, Hegel, and Marx narrated the progress of history around some version of the state, or state with capital S, and an abstract or collective protagonist, man in pursuit of fully realized reason, or in the case of Marx, the proletariat, Glendinning inherits Berlin's conception of the individual as, I quote, an unpredictably self-transforming being. Another name for Berlin's pluralism of values, Glendinning argues, is democracy, which must maintain its openness, right to self-critique, and perfectibility. The singular openness of philosophy to interrogating its own content has become, in Glendining's account, the endless perfectibility of democracy through commitment to collective deliberation and self-critique. So in other words, he starts with Europe, which equals philosophy, which then equals democracy. A more promising idea of cultural exemplarity, he says, is already making its way in Europe. Not the idea of the best example of a universally compelling way to be for man, not of Europe as a singular avant-garde of a culture of universal humanity, but as the avant-garde of a universalizable culture of singularities. One recognizes here Kant's emphasis on singularity and unity in the philosophical project that has meanwhile become the European Union. The same principle of respect for singularity shapes, in Glendining's account, the ethos of interpersonal encounters and of political life. On one hand, he draws from ordinary language philosophy, quoting Wittgenstein's attitude towards a soul and Cavell's investment in perfectionism democratized. On the other, he follows Derrida's emphasis on respect for the singularity of every other, positing a democracy to come with no projected content. Whereas Levinas had claimed that Europe was the Bible and the Greeks, this universalizable paradigm of open democracy would include everyone, anyone, all others. So this is the book. And now the critique. While I agree with Glendining that one cannot simply discard one's heritage and that one ought to deploy every effort to orient it towards the future, I worry that his lack of particularization of the other makes his work vulnerable to the critique of the West as an ideological fiction that has systematically excluded from the history of Europe and its empires those who felt both insiders and outsiders to the West. Or, in Sartre's words in the preface to Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, who knew Western civilization only through their scars. In theory, Glendining's notion of European is open to anyone and inclusive of non-white, non-Judeo-Christian others, but in practice, he does not engage with the thought of figures who claimed an affiliation with European culture, yet felt alienated from it. There is indeed Derrida, but no Césaire, no Fanon, no other critics of colonialism, and no thinkers from Eastern and Central Europe. The conversation he reconstructs includes mostly German, French, and the occasional English figure, so his Europe remains a metonymy. In fact, it refers to Western Europe. Everyone else, one assumes, should feel concerned by Glendining's paternalistic address. He writes on page 2 of volume 1, "If you are yourself a European, or have been significantly informed by the modern European understanding of the world, then the subjectivity that is interrogated here is yours, and I will be relating the story of the development of the understanding of the world that you have inherited and whose inheritance you are." What begins to suggest itself here is a sketch of the other as an integrated reject, someone whose presence is taken for granted, but whose voice does not matter. Glendining's ethical vision appears rooted in a metaphysics of a historyless, featureless other that fetishizes their singularity, but offers nothing in the way of a recognition of who they actually are. A democracy as the promise of openness to every other sounds noble and as good an aspiration as it gets, but there is no indication just how we would get there. It is as if in an indeterminate future, this other might become free of the burdens of history, and we could all forget the horror story by keeping in view only our good intentions, as if we could just seamlessly extricate ourselves from our present challenges, the concrete difficulties of multiculturalism, of environmental migration, and somehow find in our future selves a beautifully formed attitude towards another soul. It is here, it seems to me, that philosophy reaches its limits. I mean philosophy in the way Glendining inherits and practices it, committed to universality and unable to particularize the other. He claims to move beyond the two alternatives of Eurocentrism and the anti-Eurocentric recoil, which in themselves reproduce the logic of the West and the rest denounced by Stuart Hall, yet he remains Eurocentric through and through. The only way to move beyond an opposition is to take seriously and engage with the other. Here, those rejected for historical reasons the Eurocentric heading, and those other non-Western Europeans who have been struggling to balance the lure of democratic ideals with a layered inheritance of their history. Glendinning begins Volume 2 with Isaiah Berlin's inaugural lecture at Oxford, Two Concepts of Liberty, from 1958, which he reads as a reflection on the Cold War as a war over the European philosophical legacy. I can imagine a different assessment of the European legacy by considering two views from the East, and both take the form of symbolic trials. The first one is Mircea Eliade's essay Examen Leprosorum, The Lepers Trial, published in French in Preuve in April 1952. The text is an emotional appeal to the West, alerting intellectuals to the Soviet destruction of cultures in the Eastern Bloc. Like the lepers in the Middle Ages, writes Eliade, we are already condemned. He reminds his readers that at least the lepers used to have a last chance at a fair trial as an acknowledgement of their rights as citizens. By 1984, the battle of culture appeared lost. Culture has already bowed out. Milan Kundera concluded his famous essay, The Tragedy of Central Europe. In Past Imperfect, historian Tony Judd summarizes the marginal status of such figures. Quote, so long as the poets, musicians, novelists, and philosophers from Vilna, Lvov, Prague, Budapest, and Bucharest could enter into the universe of the French, they forgave the intellectuals of Paris for their failure to make equivalent gestures in response. After World War II, the situation worsened. I quote Judd again. The intelligentsia of Europe's eastern half was now doubly excluded, deprived of its own national culture by the communists, and forbidden entry into Europe's universal culture by the latter's own accredited guardians. This is the first view from the East, from Europe's internal other. The other view is from a different East, and it emerges from the Bandung Conference in 1955, which brought together representatives of 29 African and Asian countries, totaling over 1 billion people colonized by European powers. In The Color Curtain, Richard Wright describes it as a sort of judgment on the West. Indonesia, where it took place, was emerging, for example, from 350 years of Dutch rule, including 200 years of forced labor, which had left 70% of the population illiterate. I will not dwell more on these symbolic trials. One could also invoke here Césaire's indictment in Discourse on Colonialism, Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, including Sartre's preface, the 1956 Conference of African Writers in Paris, recounted by James Baldwin in Princes and Powers, and so many others. Suffice it to say that mentioning such texts would be an opportunity for Glendinning to practice the inclusiveness of the vision he puts forward, premised on, I quote him, the capacity to see how things look to other people. This might also help put the discourse of philosophical history in perspective, giving some measure of what it has obscured. France, for example, brought more slaves to the sugar plantations in Guadeloupe alone than were ever brought to North America. Marx acknowledged that slavery was indispensable to the development of Western economies, and the legacy of colonialism lives on in the monuments of Western culture. The Hall of Mirrors at Versailles is opulently decorated with gold mined by the slaves in Saint-Domingue. After World War II, immigrants from former colonies, Turkey and Eastern Europe helped rebuild and still contribute to Western economies. The Windrush scandal and Britain's hostile immigration policies suggest that many of these people are not allowed to live as unpredictably self-transforming beings. President Macron urging the Algerian youth not to dwell on past crimes and claiming that Africa should adopt French because it is the language of freedom suggests that colonialism is decidedly not a thing of the past. It just has other forms. It is such remarkable omissions in Glendinning's project that compel me to turn to the rough ground of European history and everyday lives, and to particularize the other through close engagement with the work of a diverse group of writers. For example, in the book, I zoom in on novels about enslaved people or persons marked by the trauma of forced displacement and abandonment, such as in Carol Phillips's The Nature of Blood, Anna Segers's Transit, or Sebal's Austerlitz, on guest workers and undocumented laborers from Turkey and Eastern Europe, such as in Emine Sevgi Özdamar's Das Leben ist eine Karawanserei, so Life is a Caravanserai, and The Bridge of the Golden Horn, and Dan Longo's The Girl Who Played God, on colonial migrants and their descendants struggling to integrate in a corrupt Babylon while grappling with the inheritance of memories from the Algerian War, such as in Leila Sebar-Shirazad, and from the Mussolini era in Somalia, such as in Ijaba Shego's Adwa. In calling them integrated rejects, I trace a continuum of precarious agency in relation to one's life, the meaning and direction of which have been suspended. This figure is often associated with spaces of confinement that limit one's possibilities, one's capacity to imagine a future, even one's will to live. Spaces such as political prisons, the ghetto, the camp, the detention center, the small rooms of the European precariat, or symbolically, the straitjacket of the expected daily performance of ideal citizenship. To offer you an example in the few minutes I have left, I will focus on a recent novel by Iraqi-German writer Abbas Kider, who received asylum in Germany after imprisonment as a political prisoner in Iraq and years of undocumented migration through Europe. He learned German, studied literature and philosophy, and became citizen in 2009. In 2019, he published his fifth book, German for Everyone, The Definitive Manual, a novel that poses as a grammar textbook in which he playfully reforms, like Mark Twain before him, the German language. The examples of grammar rules he provides are all lifted either from his own experiences or from the lives of people who are also political prisoners, undocumented migrants, asylum seekers, or racially profiled citizens. Kider notes humorously that a second Abbas has grown inside me, a certain Mr. Abbas Müller-Schmidt, who sometimes uses an idiosyncratic technique of reading, understanding, and phrasing in German that served him well earlier in his studies and now continues to be useful in his professional life. Now, the problem is that Kider has an accent and looks, he says, like an Arab man, two small details that interfere with the performance of model immigrant figured in the respectable Herr Abbas Müller-Schmidt. Kider lives with a disconnect between his acclaimed literary career as a German language writer and a foreign accent that still marks him another, between an inner realm lived in the projective mode of cultural integration and the social or public sphere in which his desire for recognition as a full member of society is occasionally thwarted. This experience of simultaneous inclusion and exclusion recalls Roland Barthes' figure of the integrated reject in Comment vivre ensemble. Barthes baptizes this paradoxical figure the sponge, or l'éponge, after the character of the silent nun in the Loziak history. She never, this is a quote, she never sat down at the table or partook of a particle of bread, but wiped up the crumbs with a sponge. Regularly abused by the other nuns in the monastery, she never complains. Upon being elevated to the status of a saint, following the visit of Saint Pitorum, who draws attention to her piousness, she refuses the other nuns' reverence and vanishes from the monastery forever. According to Barthes, the fate of the integrated reject is either scapegoating as the object of abuse, blamed for all the ills that befall the community, or elevation to the status of a saint, glorified as a kind of pure victim. In neither of these situations is she a full subject, a sovereign over her own life. These features describe the displaced persons caught in the net of the refugee system. The extreme reactions mentioned by Barthes, scapegoating and sanctification, sum up what Slavoj Žižek has called the double blackmail in the context of the refugee crisis. On one hand, the denigration of refugees by the right, which blames them for exhausting economic resources, for inequality and crime, and on the other hand, liberal pieties on the left, which cast refugees as pure victims who ought to be welcomed on grounds of a shared humanity. Here is how Abbas Kider experiences the condition of the integrated reject. So this is an example from his book. The German subclause he wants to get rid of all articles, of nouns, of declension, of conjugation, so to simplify the German language. And now he's talking about subclauses. And he says, the German subclause often reminds me of two authorities with whom I had to spend a lot of time in my life, an Iraqi and a German one. For years, they stood between my studies and me. So he was imprisoned by Saddam Hussein's by Saddam Hussein's government just after he graduated from high school, and he was on his way to university. The Iraqi dictatorship, represented by the prison guards who tortured him to say only what they wanted to hear, and the German bureaucracy who expected him to narrate his life in a way that would fit with its specific scenarios of what counts as persecution. These two authorities, have conspired to put his life on hold. They delineate what it means to live in a language, in Kider's world, where doublethink in Iraq, and I'm borrowing the term with Svetan Todorov from Orwell, so where doublethink is on a continuum with the fraught bilingualism of integration. In light of this continuity, Kider's joke about the model immigrant who has grown inside him, Herr Abbas Müller-Schmidt, captures something that is no laughing matter. One can only surmise that the choice of a name he cannot pronounce, because he cannot pronounce, he says, the sound U. So the choice of a name he cannot even pronounce is a reliable symptom of alienation. One discovers it as a peculiar kind of laughter. In the inaugural scene of Oranges from the President, alluded to in this grammar manual, Mahdi is brutally beaten up by a prison guard nicknamed Charlie Chaplin on account of his diminutive stature and funny mustache. And I quote from that novel, "When he battered a prisoner, he bit with zest his sharp teeth into his bulging tongue and yelled, so that saliva would trickle through the corners of his mouth. He went at animals and struck us on and on like a machine." Like the capitalist machine that swallows up the worker in Charlie Chaplin's fable of automation, Modern Times, the regime assimilates the prison guard and the prisoner into its inhumanity in a show of objection. The pantomime is broken only by a deprecating word, the stamp of totalitarianism. Violent interrogations are similarly efforts by the guards of imposing a narrative that casts Mahdi and his friends as subversive political dissidents. Frustration and denials of wrongdoing drown in the outpouring of accusatory insinuations reinforced by torture. A totalitarian regime imposing its discourse on a population, contradicting the reality of their experience to the point of madness. This is Kider's picture of schizophrenic dialogism in a prison country where all political subjects are integrated rejects, the lives arrested in the absurd scenario of a collective nightmare. Whereas in Iraq, the experience of the integrated reject manifests itself in distorted truths and tortured bodies, in a blurring of boundaries between the human in human violence and the non-human animal, in Germany, it will assume the hygiene of classification, sorting out, cleaning and discarding, a hygiene Kider's personae mimic with bemused docility. The uncanny resemblance between the screening of asylum seekers and the recycling of trash insinuates itself in a brief episode in Ohrfeige, featuring the first-person narrator Karim, who takes up a dismally paid temporary job while waiting for his asylum case to be sorted out. "It's all a simple language game," he shows. "I just had to learn a couple of words and sentences which I kept using again and again. Where does this go? Plastic or trash? Thank you, welcome, hello, goodbye." The narrative that Germany has welcomed refugees as the moral amendment to its past is complicated in Ohrfeige by the simple logic of recycling learned by Karim. This logic gingerly points readers to the workings of a system that sorts people according to formal criteria, counting in those whose usefulness is economically justified and out those who are foreign matter, therefore disposable. It also recalls Adorno's economic analysis of the included-excluded, another instance of the integrated reject, in theory. Workers who are hired with no benefits only when convenient in the economic cycle, any fluctuations of it resulting in those individuals becoming disposable. The novel reinforces this logic when Karim learns that securing asylum is not the end of the bureaucratic saga, in a fictionalization of Kider's own experience of taking his baccalaureate exam 3 times before he was deemed a qualified candidate for university studies in Germany, which also required mastering advanced German. "We are pleased that you want to learn the language," Mr. Sepp tells Karim, who is eager to pursue humanities studies, a dream previously thwarted by Iraqi authorities. "First, however, he must work for a year and pay taxes. A position at Burger King will provide health insurance and some money, as well as help him slowly become a good citizen," he's told. And a good citizen, that's Bürger, right? So citizen in German. "Excuse me," said Rafid. "How is that? Become a good burger?" So he doesn't make the distinction between U and U. "No," said Mr. Sepp, "not a burger, citizen, inhabitant of the country. Bürger with umlaut, national citizen, German, at Burger King. Work, then citizen." "Oh, I see, sorry." Rafid's confusion, ostensibly caused by his inability to differentiate between a vowel and a diphthong, zooms in on the one precondition to the integration process: economic usefulness. Access to German, and thus to self-expression, is conditioned by the adoption of mindless industriousness. Karim's saga is echoed by Kider in Deutsch für alle. "I took on jobs waiting for my life." And this is the last part of the paper. Integrating into German society requires unfathomable patience, efforts, resilience, and many years of someone's life, during which a German alter ego usurps the inner sanctum of the person one used to be. I read the Germanized Abbas Müller-Schmidt as an aberration of a person who has lost his mental equilibrium from trying so hard to integrate, his efforts blurring the difference between unskilled labor and language learning. While studying for his second baccalaureate exam, he remembers he was cleaning the offices of a women's magazine in the early morning and a private hospital in the afternoon. The famous shot with Chaplin's worker tightening screws on an always faster moving belt comes to mind again. Fully swallowed by the machinery and run through it, he's released, unhinged in mind. A kindred spirit, Müller-Schmidt keeps cleaning offices, hospitals, the ancient city of language itself, its alleys and buildings, pursuing a mad fantasy in which everything at long last, will be tidy and immaculate. Then he will sit down, basking in quiet satisfaction. This is the last quote. When one lives in a language like in a home, one treats it differently. For example, one does a weekly cleaning, like in one's apartment. Every day a thing or two gets tidied up, or at least the trash goes downstairs. At home, one wants to sit comfortably on the sofa of good conscience. I myself moved into German quite a while ago and have been feeling at home here. Now that I have renovated a little and even remodeled, I have finally reached my aim. My new German is like a well-tempered home of clean letters and fine grammatical cases. Unquote. A well-tempered instrument that outperforms the original, proudly signaling its elective affinity with one of the highest monuments of German Kultur. Neudeutsch is a miraculous product embodying the very industriousness touted by the system as a path to full citizenship. Arbeit, dann Bürger. Herr Abbas Müller-Schmidt has internalized it to such a degree that he might have become more German than Germans, more European than Europeans. Neudeutsch projects the comforting utopia for language for everyone, where a fellowship in language can at last be taken for granted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Corina. Thank you for this very rich talk. So I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions afterwards, but we're going to move on to the second talk. So I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Judith Misraï-Barak, who is Associate Professor at University Paul Valéry Montpellier III in France, where she teaches English and postcolonial literatures. She has published numerous articles and book chapters, her prime areas of specialization being Caribbean and Indo- and Sino-Caribbean literatures in English, diaspora, and migrant writing. Dalit literatures are among her more recent interests, and she was co-investigator on an AHRC Research Network series on writing, analyzing, translating Dalit literature. She is now co-investigator on an AHRC follow-on funding for impact and engagement on on stage and on page, celebrating Dalit and Adivasi literatures and performing arts. She's also co-investigator on the Thanatic Ethics Project and general editor of the series POCO Pages at the Presse Universitaire de la Méditerranée. Her latest publications are a chapter on Edwidge Dantica's short stories, published in Bloomsbury Handbook on Edwidge Dantica, published in 2021, a co-edited volume, Kalapani Crossings, Revisiting 19th Century Migrations from India's Perspective, published by Routledge in 2021, and finally, a monograph, Entre Atlantique et Océan Indien, Les Voix de la Caraïbe anglophone, published by Classique Garnier, also in 2021. So the title of her talk today is Unearthing the Bones, Narrative as Forensics, a reading of Michael Ondaatje's Anil's Ghost. Thank you very much, Judith.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Alice and Eloise. So we're going to shift, in fact, from the European context to South Asia and South Asian context. But we can definitely keep in mind, the notion of distances and of integrated rejects, that Corinna has introduced us to. In the context of the novel, I'm going to focus on the characters are killed before they can actually become refugees. So that's one of the major differences between the contexts. So social scientists know how crucial it is to identify the bodies of the men, women, children who have died at sea or on land or have been buried in mass burial grounds, and how consequential it is to engage or not in some form of ritual, of identification and memorialization. While some scholars have focused on locating and numbering those victims or on the objects of migration that were lost or discarded, others have used forensic science to identify the bodies so that the families can get them back, engage in mourning, and continue to live. The question I would like to raise here is that of the literary text, whether there is such a thing as what could be called literary forensics. And it's, I live a lot by serendipity. And as I was working on this article, I became acquainted with the work of Mita Banerjee, and one of the seminars, or webinars she gave on the series of Thanatic Ethics. And she used the phrase literary forensics as well. So I want to, acknowledge that. There was a kind of meeting as well there. So the question I would like to raise here is that of the literary text and whether there is such a thing as literary forensics, to what purpose and to what effect. So this paper will focus on Michael Ondaatje's Anil's Ghost. So as you may know, it's a novel that deals with the exhumation and identification of bones during the civil war in Sri Lanka, that civil war that tore the country to shreds between 1983 and 2009, and ended up with what can be claimed as a genocide by the Sri Lankan Tamils. Ondaatje offers a context in the epigraph, suggesting that he will not take sides, that he will, remain neutral. He seems that, it looks as if he's going to be objective, whatever that means. Even if it is not the primary object of this article, it should be said, and I really want to say it, that this seemingly neutral standpoint is brought down, if not put to shame, by other elements in the novel that indirectly point to a perspective that is far from neutral. The Buddhist presence, for instance, can be seen as one of the elements that only give more prominence to the majority, because let's remember that it is the Sinhala Buddhist majority that is, versus the Tamil Hindu minority that is at work, in fact, in Sri Lanka. The latter being generally restricted to the terrorist category in the novel. So that said, Sri Lankan-born, formerly Sinhala-speaking, and North American-educated Anil Tisera goes back to Sri Lanka as a forensic anthropologist, 15 years after having left her native island. She responded to a call that had gone out from the Center of Human Rights in Geneva for a forensic anthropologist to go to Sri Lanka and investigate the political killings of the civil war. In Anil's search for identification, the bones of the dead are literally unearthed. Forensics are resorted to, scientifically and metaphorically, to investigate the crime, reveal the truth about their deaths, but also, quote, settle the dead in the world of the dead, unquote. And this is a quote from the critic Margaret Herrick. Through the literary text, the forensic search makes it possible for the living to return to the world of the living and allows both the dead and the living to return to the realm of a visible and tangible humanity. So in this paper, I'm not so concerned with how the literary text represents, or rather presents, the trauma of civil war and terrorist violence. There was abundant, critical literature that was produced on Anil's ghost, analyzing the novel from many different perspectives. I'm interested here in how the literary text contributes to addressing historical horrors, as well as redressing the social injustices that still wreck our present. With bones being literally unearthed in the story, what does the text perform in its literariness for those lost or unidentified bodies that could not be accomplished directly? What kind of engagement does it offer, and how is it offered? In a text-based approach and using the angle of forensics and thanatic ethics as an ethics that cares for the dead and ultimately endeavors to repair the living, I want to formulate the hypothesis that literary forensics enables a certain justice to be delivered to the living in a symbolic court of law. Forensis, if we have a look at the etymology, this is interesting, allowing for a return to the world of the living, moving beyond the stigmatization of the unritual, as Valérie Loiseau puts it. It probes the fraught relationship between literature and forensic pathology, investigating the possibility that the narrative of the identification of the unidentified body of the dead could create a public space to be shared by all, and that is a forum, same etymology. Even if it means ultimately acknowledging vulnerability. After stepping onto the scene of archaeology and forensic pathology, the process of identification of one individual skeleton will come center stage, as well as the question of the performativity of the text in the way it folds and unfolds and is structured and destructured. So, archaeology or forensic pathology, what bodies, whose bodies? It seems one cannot step directly into the exhumation field. A detour is needed, and this is what happens at the beginning of the book. Before the first section of the book, the reader is actually offered the first of many passages in italics that are scattered across the 300 pages of the book, seemingly taking us away from the expected scene of action, but in fact, providing us with a lot of elements that will be crucial to understanding what is at stake in the unraveling of the mystery. Anil's ghost opens with an indirect vigil for the dead. Again, watchfulness, being awake, etc. Vigilare in Latin. One that will keep us awake throughout the whole novel. A couple of pages go back analeptically to an earlier excavation site Anil had gone to in Guatemala, searching for the remains of the killed and the disappeared, while the family members waited on the side of the graves or sometimes stepped into the graves, expecting to be able to identify one of their loved ones. Ondaatje takes us to what Herrick calls a liminal space, inhabited precariously by both the dead and the living, unquote. The introductory pages clarify Anil Tissera's personal and professional situation as she's shown returning from her diasporic abode. Immediately after the incipit, a second page in italics follows suit, mentioning an excavation field in China, this time, surprisingly, The crime scene is one that requires history and archaeology more than forensic pathology. It is a series of Buddhist cave temples in Shaanxi province where the victims are bodhisattvas. The description of their destruction is not only reminiscent of the Buddhas of Banyan, destroyed by the Taliban in Afghanistan in March 2001, 1 year after the publication of the novel, but also one that suggests the dismemberment of a human body, as if it was a living human body. Quote, "This was the place of a complete crime, heads separated from bodies, hands broken off. None of the bodies remained. All the statuary had been removed in the few years following its discovery by Japanese archaeologists. In 1918, the bodhisattvas quickly bought up by museums in the West. 3 torsos in a museum in California. A head lost in a river south of the Singh Desert, adjacent to the pilgrim routes," unquote. Even if the reader doesn't quite understand at first how Guatemala or China are connected to Sri Lanka, or how the destroyed statues of Buddhas are connected to the mass burial sites, what is made clear by Ondaatje is that the novel's larger context is one of post-1989 crimes against humanity, and that archaeology and forensic pathology cannot be separated. Human bodies, dead or alive, are connected in the humanity they incarnate. So are the broken bodies or the smashed statues. So this is the novelistic backdrop against which Anil meets Sahat, Sahal de Yasena, the Colombo government-appointed archaeologist, who thinks this collaboration with Geneva-appointed forensic pathologists is an odd pairing, to say the least. Yet much further in the novel, he's going to explain they're going to become closer. And Sahat then mentions another dig in China, suggesting again the co-presence of archaeology and forensic pathology and the myriad modalities of the emergence of truth. So maybe I'll skip this. I mean, there is a beautiful description of the discovery of a water tomb where actually 20 female musicians have been buried along with their instruments. And when they remove the skeletons from the coffins, they discovered that no damage has been done to the bones to reveal how the musicians have been killed. There was not a single, fractured bone. But in fact, what Ondaatje wants us to understand here indirectly and proleptically is that bones will speak. So in all cases mentioned above, in Guatemala or China, it is sometimes difficult in the description to decide if we find ourselves in an archaeological site or in a mass burial site, where forensics are required besides archaeology. All the sites point to the closeness of the dead body underground and the living body above ground. Sometimes one doesn't know which is which, as suggested in another passage in italics where Anil dreams of the shape of her own body being drawn on the floor with a felt marker, just as it is done for a body in a crime scene. Through the many mentions of exhumation sites, Ondaatje points to this: dig one must in either case, excavate one must in either case, for the sake of both the dead and the living. And the boundaries between who is dead and who is alive are, of course, often blurred. Whose bodies, what bodies? So in a book that is called Ghostly Narratives and the Limits of Fiction, Joanne Lipson-Fried argues that Ondaatje's novel is ultimately flawed because even if it works of haunting may open possibilities for the reader to turn to action, it further marginalizes the marginalized, as it fails to give distinctive characteristics to the disappeared and favors instead the more metropolitan characters, Anil, for instance. It is true that the novel does not focus on giving back specific characteristics to the bodies of those who died in terrorist attacks and civil warfare or were buried in the mass burial graves, yet, against the backdrop of several exhumation sites in different countries, the novel rapidly zooms in on one particular skeleton, that is discovered in a government-protected archaeological site in the Bandarawala region, where prehistoric remains were discovered in 1911. Layers of time. Huh? Among the skeletons, the site still yields one attracts Anil's attention. In the far reaches of a cave, a fourth skeleton, quote, whose bones were still held together by dried ligaments, partially burned, something not prehistoric, unquote. So it is the interaction between the bones and the environment they were placed in that reveals it is a recent murder victim. Quote, there are trace elements you can find in bones, mercury, lead, arsenic, even gold, that don't belong to them. They seep in from the surrounding soil, or they can move from the bone into the adjacent soil. These elements are always passing into and out of bones, whether they are in coffins or not. Well, in this skeleton, there are traces of lead all over him, but there is no lead in this cave where we found him. The soil samples show none. Do you see? He must have been buried somewhere else before. Someone took precautions to make sure the skeleton was not discovered. This is no ordinary murder or burial. They buried him, then later moved him to an older gravesite, unquote. The archaeological site has now become a crime scene. Anil and Sahat label the skeletons tinker, tailor, soldier, and sailor. Sailor, the recent one, the murdered one, is at the heart of the criminal and political mystery to be solved. Yet in no way does Ondaatje forget the thousands of unidentified bones and skeletons, nor the thousands of families yearning for identification and responses. Who was he? Quote, this representative of all those who lost voices, to give him a name would name the rest, unquote. In fact, from that discovery onwards, Ondaatje not only focuses on that single skeleton, but also on the dialogue that is happening between his two main protagonists and the skeleton. Thus showing Ondaatje's focus is on the living as much as on the dead, on what can be accomplished through this dialogue with the unidentified bones of the dead. I will get to this in the last part of the paper. For the moment, let us linger a little longer on Anil's and Sahat's investigation of Sailor's death and on their struggle against his invisibility and anonymity. So it's a highly sensitive political investigation that is led in a country that is still what Sahat calls a fearful nation, where, quote, death, loss was unfinished, so you could not walk through it, unquote. Identifying the skeleton will enable the survivors, the investigators, and by proxy, the readers, to walk through death and loss. In their investigation, Anil and Sahat must look for support and clues. But first, they listen to what Sailor himself tells them, and they decipher the signs his bones offer. Coming to understand what his last moments were will help understand the cause of death and determine responsibilities. Before reaching that stage, it is the physical gestures of forensics that are performed first, and Sahat treats the skeletons in his lab with all the care he could give to a living body. Quote, he began cleaning the bones of the skeleton, drilling free the fragments of dirt. Then he turned on a slim hose and let it hover over each bone, air nestling into the evidence of the trauma, as if it were blowing cool breath from a pursed mouth onto a child's burn. He dipped the camel hair brush into the dish and began painting a layer of protective plastic over the bones, moving down the spine and ribs, unquote. There is tenderness and absolute love and absolute care in the sweep of Sahat's hand and in the brush of his fingers, as if Ondaatje was actually exposing the continuity of bones and the kinship of bodies, in opposition to the scorching they have gone through. The aim is to reveal responsibilities in the open light of day, even if it is not the only stake in the process, as we will see. Revelation is indeed, in all the photosensitive meaning of the term, at the heart of the fastidious labor of forensics that is deployed in and by the narrative. I could develop the motif of the light and darkness, but I'll skip that. So in this quest of light and revelation, Anil and Sarat need helpers, just as in fairy tales, even if it is a tale of nightmare. So I want to turn to them in the next stage, and they will take us to the last stage of the paper, to the forum I was mentioning earlier. So I would like to suggest that the interventions of and between the numerous helpers in Anil's ghost counteract symbolically the violence that imbues most of the places and moments in the novel. A whole network of characters is gradually sketched around Anil and Sarat, reflecting, speculating, contributing suggestions, offering protection to, in the paradoxical movement of reaching out to keep safe. Different circles are drawn up. The scientists constitute the first of those circles. Palipana and his brother Narada, two archaeologists, are there as helpers. Palipana is the epigraphist whose power of sight has turned inward. He made his name translating Pali scripts and translating rock graffiti. Anil and Sarat turn to him when they need to find someone to read and interpret Sailor's skull. Palipana reads the skull as he would have done ancient rock inscriptions, but it is the power of touch that is actually implemented. Other science and archaeology are called upon in this collaborative approach. Medicine, forensics, several medical doctors. I've got a whole list of characters, I'll skip that. Palynology, forensic geology, entomology also help identify the traces of soil, pollen grains and spores that fuse to the bones. There is an entomologist who also helps identify the first burial site. All of them are helpers in the process. The network of helpers also grows organically from within, one connection leading to another. Victims sometimes become helpers. One example, for the ones of you who know the novel, would be Gunesena, that young man who was actually nailed to the tarmac, as in a modern crucifixion. He becomes a helper, and he is the one who helps Anil out at the end of the novel. Second, when Anil seeks the epigraphist's help to discover if Sailor's murder was committed by the government, Palipana's response includes telling them about the tradition of Netra Mangala, the ritual of the eyes, when a special artist, an artificer, is actually needed to paint the eyes on the Buddha image at 5 in the morning and animate it with life at the precise hour when the Buddha attained enlightenment. Palipana refers them to Ananda as, constituting this network as well. So these multiple relationships in the novel constantly create new affiliations and perspectives. In these combined networks of sciences and reconfigured webs of characters that are woven around Anil and Sarat, two apparently contradictory movements unfold. One is vertical, another is horizontal. The vertical drive consists in digging under the surface of the ground, mining the earth, excavating the burial sites, unearthing the bones to force the truth to rise to the surface. The horizontal drive consists in resorting to all the assistance possible, reaching out to many characters, turning them into helpers, connecting people in a rhizomatic way, putting out lateral shoots, thus going against the very separation, antagonism, and violence that is described in the novel. Such a horizontal, all-encompassing energy that brings people together is also performed at another, deeper level. The text sweeps across past, present, and future moments, in a progress that is less linear than haptic, an approach that would combine the sense of touch, kinesthesis, and proprioception, that is the body's appreciation of its own movement. Places and cultural references are also embraced in a similar sweeping motion. It has been described by a critic as drifting. I mean, the novel, was described as drifting. And I now want to speculate some more about the possible meaning and implications of such drifting. And I think in French, I would have used the word vagabondage. So, in her book review of Ondaatje's novel, Janet Maslin expresses her admiration for Ondaatje, for being able to commingle, quote, commingle anguish and seductiveness in fierce, unexpected ways, unquote, but also her frustration with the way the novel mingles so many elements that seem totally foreign to the primary focus on the warfare between government, anti-government insurgents, and separatist guerrilla forces. I have to quote a little bit of this. The book drifts in flashbacks, for instance, from Guatemala to the Miami bedroom, where Anil has a tryst with her married lover, Callis, who is as much on her mind as Sailor, the skeleton. She speaks about the Spanish names for bones. He says he has written something about Norwegian snakes. But as to how such moments connect with the book's essential business in Sri Lanka, that remains indistinct. Frustratingly so, since the scattered aspects of this voyage of discovery are separately so powerful, unquote. Now, as a response to my introductory question about what the literary text performs for those lost or unidentified bodies that could not be accomplished directly, I would like to suggest that this seemingly drifting style is at the very heart of what Ondaatje achieves in a wonderfully sophisticated way. The dynamics of drifting in the novel serves the precise purpose of enabling a reading whose ultimate raison d'être is to focus on what matters, to create a space of identification and recognition, of togetherness and kinship in the text, crossing boundaries and countering the dehumanization, the killing, and the polarization at work in the story. The text drifts in several ways, and I propose to see this drifting as part of the literary counter-forensics that is at stake here, in a movement born out of the necessity to identify the bones of the murdered, but which expands far beyond the mass burial site. Not only does it enable a certain justice to be delivered in an open court of law, forensics, but also it goes beyond forensics and authorizes the creation of a public space to share. I will select just 3 forms of drifting to examine how such a forum is generated in the text as the living move out of the limbo zone of trauma and mourning back into the community of the living. First, as was mentioned earlier, passages in italics punctuate the novel, endowed with a complex role to play in the time scheme of the narrative. References to Anil's investigation in Guatemala or China, to a terrorist attack in a tunnel, to the National Atlas of Sri Lanka, to the eye painter Ananda Odugama, or to Ananda's wife Sirisa, or to Sarat's wife Ravina, etc., constitute the pith and marrow, if I dare say so, of those passages in italics. Most of the time, the reader is not able to understand immediately why they are taken through those moments, which makes me think those moments are structured to work as trauma. One is not able to understand what is happening at the time of the event, but only much later, when you go back to them, or rather when they come back to you. A constant element that pertains to those pages in italics is that the characters that appear in them will be introduced formally only later in the diegesis, making those passages proleptic as well as analeptic, creating connections across the narrative. A couple of instances will show my point. Palipana is mentioned in passing in the second passage in italics, page 12. But we're only introduced to him diegetically in the section The Grove of Hypetics, page 79. And actually meet him at the same time as Anil, page 85, after a few more drifting passages that situate Palipana in his professional and personal history, as well as in the forest grove he has retired to. Ananda Ugama, the eye painter, is the object of the fifth passage in italics, but we have to wait until Palipana refers Anil and Sarat to him to rebuild the head of sailor. That's, you know, and then it's only later that we actually meet him diegetically, but briefly, in the section A Brother, which is mostly about Sarat's brother, Gamini. Finally, a whole section will be named after him, Ananda, but that's much later. The same braiding could be done for Sirisa and Ravina, the wives of Ananda and Sarat, respectively, among other characters. A second form of drifting occurs through the other, much more straightforward analepsis that haunt the narrative and morph it into a nimble object. Many analepses take us to Anil's personal life and memories. Her love affair with the married man Kulis, her memories of her marriage with a Sri Lankan medical student, her youth memories of the monsoon, of the time she was a swimmer, her reminiscing of her American girlfriend, Leaf, whose memory is being erased by Alzheimer fast, her studies in North America, and that's the best part of it, the Fuck Yorick School of Forensics. The third and last form of drifting, to be underlined here, is the one that materializes through the abundance of literary and cultural references that far exceed the boundaries of the tear-shaped island. It includes scientific annals and medical publications, a wide range of literary references, from the Greek poet Archilochus to Kipling, Goethe. It mentioned writers like Agatha Christie, Enid Blyton, John Masters, many others. Specific novels like Le Grand Maulne, L'Homme au Masque de Fer, Les Misérables. Singers like Frank Sinatra. Specific songs like The Good Ship Venus, Coming in from the Cold, Don't Know Much About Entomology. Or Tom Waits' Hey Ho, which is significantly a mining song. So, what is the link between all those mentions and references? Why such sweeping gestures across continents and cultural references in a novel about the civil war in Sri Lanka and the unidentified bones of the murdered? What is the impact of a time scheme that is bound to confuse the reader? We never quite know what to expect, nor what to look for at first. And then we have to look back in order to see where we are going. Very confusing. Reading the novel through the lens of terrorist fiction, Margaret Scanlon argues that, that's a quote, "The distinctive achievement in Anil's Ghost is to create a narrative structure that replicates the experience of terror," unquote. She uses what another critic, Ursula Heiss, calls chronoschisms. Those, quote, "abrupt breaks in time that shatter the unifying time of the individual mind. The chronoschisms create a sense of time experienced through terror. By people living in fear, they can be blown away in any instant, to whom historical perspective is an alien luxury," unquote. Whether we speak about the structured like trauma narratives or about text time that shatters story time, it is up to the reader to put the pieces back together. Reattach this episode with that one. Connect this character with that one. I want to suggest that this drifting within the frame of a complex time structure can be interpreted in three other ways that would not necessarily be in contradiction with holding the experience of terror at the heart of reading, but would highlight what is there to accomplish, to counter the experience of terror. First, the freedom that was expelled from the story climbs back in through the text. Story stays within the borders of the island, within the contours of violence, conflict, destruction, whereas text roams freely beyond borders and boundaries, across emotions and timelines. The malleability of the space and time schemes gives the text the freedom the story doesn't have. Text, as a nimble object, cannot be constrained by the shackles of story. Second, it implicates the reader in creating invisible connections that are revealed only eventually. We already know Palipana, Ananda, Sirisa, Ravina when we meet them later on in the chapters. In fact, we recognize them more than we meet them or discover them, as if we had always already known them. So the text brings together instead of hacking and wrenching apart. It relies on care, love, and agency, where there was none. As we have seen with Sarat's forensic treatment of the bones, it creates a subterranean flow, a bond of affinities between characters, countries, cultures, a forum for everyone to participate in. A space of identification that is one of recognition and kinship, while also providing a court of law where social justice can be delivered symbolically. Third, some references will be missed by the reader, but others, like the characters whom we are made to recognize eventually, will breed familiarity and place us, readers, in a tantalizing proximity to the characters, to Anil particularly. Shooting off from a phrase Debjani Ganguly uses to describe the emergence of a humanitarian sensibility in the 18th century novel, one could say the drifting produces what she calls an architectonics of proximity and, I would add, distance. A paradoxical space and time where possibilities are opened by creating distance and proximity all at once. One could almost compare this paradoxical space and time with the hovering or the evenly suspended attention that is at work in psychoanalysis, a directionless attention that does not hold preconceived suppositions or interpretations, a space which brings you closer to what truly matters while maintaining distance, a floating attention. I have no idea if this works in English. Attention flottante. So floating attention, does it work? You let me know. And this is where we would need to have another look at Anil's transnational situation, defined as it is by a complex, haptic relationship to proximity and distance, stasis and movement. I'll skip a bit about what I wanted to say about her transnational situation, but basically I wanted to insist on her ambiguous situation and status. She constantly has, in fact, her long distance gaze, right? She is constantly in control. She wants to be in control. She wants to be objective. She wants to be, to keep at a distance and to be in control. She insists on not being a prodigal when she comes back to Sri Lanka. She insists on the fact that the island no longer held her by her past. And of course, we understand by the throat. So all the aspects of Anil's professional as well as her personal and sexual life seem painted in what has been labeled as detachment and alienation. I see ambivalence, ambiguity and fluidity at the heart of who she is, not to be constrained by anything or anyone. Is there any link between her transnational status, and I'm keeping an eye on the time, is there any link between her transnational status and her profession? Again, Ganguly sees Anil's training as a forensic pathologist as an extension of her diasporic status. Both are ultimately distancing, So in the absolute commitment she has towards her profession and the discovery of truth, however, Anil will learn to negotiate how far or how close she should be, how objective she should be, how empathetic she should be. In forensic science, as in medicine, you need distance to be able to reach a valid conclusion and not let yourself be engulfed by emotion. And yet, one also needs empathy. The journey Anil performs in the novel is one that takes her from maintaining an abstract distance to embracing a much closely, a more embodied approach in her work, in her work as in the management of her own personal grief. So, in fact, what she finally lets go of is her fantasy of invulnerability, her fantasy of mastery. And of course, you will, listen to Judith Butler in those terms. What she finally acquires, and the reader with her, is the awareness that only through an embodied sociality, and this is quoted by Herrick, referring to Merleau-Ponty, is one able to emerge out of extreme grief and violence, reaching some form of truth and justice, not absolute ones. The community of beings that is woven around the identification of Sellers' bones through the drifting text fulfills the purpose of one such embodied sociality, one in which we can accept to be exposed to our human vulnerability and precarity. So as a conclusion, short one, most of the energy of Anil's ghost emerges from the forensic search into the bones of the dead. Yet, Ondaatje focuses on what the forensic quest on the bones of the dead does to the living. He ultimately translates the forensic search that flows through the narrative into an embodied energy that set the living free. The mystery at the heart of the novel is, in fact, the mystery of the living, as is demonstrated by Sahat himself. In a text saturated with illegible deaths, this is a quote from Ganguly, the reader is left to deal with a truth that can only be reached through a community of feelings, a community of bodies, a co-presence shared in emotion, an aesthetic vision. The final pages of the novel resonate with the incipit, that scene you remember in Guatemala, where the dead and the living were sharing the same liminal space of grief. The last scene shows Ananda involved in the reconstruction of the Buddha that was shattered to pieces, with the community of villagers very close to a mass burial site. And the fact of keeping this project, going, in fact, actually protects the community of the villagers. The reconstruction of the artwork that implicates one's own body and all the bodies of the community portend of a possible life ahead, beyond the radical losses that were encountered, and in the heightened awareness of one's own vulnerability. In Herrick's words, it is this very corporeal vulnerability and exposure to others that makes it possible to return to the world of the living after suffering such catastrophic losses, unquote. Ondaatje's novel does just that, even if it can be criticized for a problematic rendering of the Tamil minority and what they went through. It uses forensics to create a forum so that we can hope to enjoy, once again, being alive. In a haptic manner, the novel invites us to embrace, once again, and this is the last sentence of the novel, the sweet touch from the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judith, for this wonderful paper. And thank you very much for talking about this book, which I like very much, and also for introducing this notion of drifting, because this is really, this was my experience as a reader, that I kept wondering, you know, but why is it taking us, especially, I mean, Guatemala, I could see the link, but all the references to her romantic life, you know, in other places and, you know, in hotel rooms and all that. And I kept wondering, why is he doing that? So thank you very much. This is clearer.
Wonderful.
Thanks. Yeah, thank
if
you.
it can, you know, help some reading, yeah, then it's wonderful. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.